Dr. Marcus Chen pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Terran Refugee Center, immediately hit by the overwhelming mix of sounds, smells, and sights that had become all too familiar since Earth joined the Galactic Federation 3 years ago. The massive warehouse-like building buzzed with activity as dozens of alien species wandered the corridors, some with multiple arms reaching out desperately to ward passing humans, others huddled in corners with eyes that reflected colors he'd never seen before. Children from various worlds chased each other between the makeshift sleeping areas while their parents filled out endless paperwork in languages that made his head spin. Marcus had been putting off this visit for months, telling himself he was too busy with his veterinary practice. The truth was simpler and more painful. He was lonely, and adopting an alien refugee felt like admitting that his own species hadn't been enough to fill the void left by his family's death. The facility coordinator, a tired-looking woman named Janet with coffee stains on her uniform, grabbed his arm with surprising strength and began steering him past the more popular areas where families crowded around the friendly, colorful aliens, who reminded them of cartoon characters or beloved pets. "Most people want the easy ones," she explained, her voice carrying a hint of frustration that Marcus recognized from his own work with abandoned animals. "The ones that smile and speak perfect English and don't require too much emotional investment. But we've got some real challenges in the back sections. Aliens who've been here for over a year with no interest from potential adopters." As they walked deeper into the facility, the atmosphere grew noticeably quieter and more somber, with aliens who sat alone, avoided eye contact, or showed visible signs of trauma that made even the most compassionate humans uncomfortable. Marcus noticed how the lighting grew dimmer in these sections, as if the building itself was trying to hide these forgotten souls from view. And he felt his chest tighten with a familiar ache that reminded him of walking through the cemetery where his wife and daughter were buried. Janet stopped abruptly in front of a corner area that was separated from the main corridor by a thin partition, and when she pulled back the curtain, Marcus saw her a figure sitting perfectly still on a narrow cot, staring out through a small window at the city skyline beyond. The alien woman was humanoid in shape, but clearly not human, with skin that looked like polished silver catching the afternoon light, and hair that appeared to be made of some kind of crystal material hanging limply around her shoulders without any of the shine or color that Marcus somehow expected it should have. Her eyes were large and violet, the kind of purple he'd only seen in deep space photographs, but they held such profound sadness that Marcus had to resist the urge to step backward. "This is Zara," Janet whispered, and Marcus noticed that even her voice became softer in the alien's presence. "She's an Etherian. Well, she's the only Etherian left in the entire galaxy, actually, which makes her adoption situation particularly complicated." Janet explained in hushed tones that Zara's entire homeworld had been wiped out by some kind of plague that the Federation scientists still didn't fully understand, leaving her as the sole survivor of her entire species, and that she hadn't spoken a single word in the 8 months since her arrival at the center. Marcus watched as other potential adopters had walked past Zara's area throughout the day, some stopping briefly to look before quickly moving on, others not even noticing her presence in the shadowy corner, but something about her stillness and the way she seemed to absorb the very light around her drew him forward. Despite Janet's continued warnings about her lack of responsiveness and the strange reports from staff about how people felt unusually emotional after spending time near her, as Marcus approached slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements, Zara's head turned slightly toward him, and for just a moment, could have sworn he saw the faintest flicker of blue light pass through her crystalline hair like electricity, through a wire, gone so quickly that he wondered if he'd imagined it. The moment their eyes met, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, not quite pain, not quite relief, but something deeper and more complex that reminded him of the first time he'd held his newborn daughter. That mixture of overwhelming responsibility and unexpected hope that had changed his entire understanding of what it meant to care for another living being. And he knew with absolute certainty that he couldn't walk away from this broken, beautiful creature who somehow seemed to recognize the same kind of loss in him that he saw reflected in her violet eyes. The first week with Zara in his apartment above the veterinary clinic felt like living with a ghost who cast no shadow. As she moved silently through the rooms, touching nothing, speaking to no one, and eating barely enough of the specialized nutrient paste to keep herself alive while Marcus watched helplessly from the kitchen doorway, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life by bringing home someone who seemed determined to fade away entirely. Every morning he would find her sitting in the exact same position by the large window that overlooked the busy street below, her silver skin catching the early sunlight, while her crystalline hair remained as dull and lifeless as broken glass. And no matter what Marcus tried, offering different foods, playing soft music, even attempting basic conversation, she would simply stare through him as if he didn't exist at all. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when old Mrs. Patterson rushed into the clinic carrying her ancient tabby cat, Whiskers, who was barely breathing and had been refusing food for 3 days, and as Marcus worked frantically to find a vein for the IV line, he suddenly became aware of a presence behind him and turned to find Zara standing in the doorway, her violet eyes fixed intently on the struggling animal with an expression he'd never seen before. Something had changed in her posture. A subtle shift from the defeated slump she'd carried for days to an alert, almost predatory focus that made the hair on the back of Marcus's neck stand up as he realized she was no longer the broken, empty shell who'd been haunting his apartment, but something else entirely. Something that recognized suffering when she saw it and couldn't ignore it any longer. Mrs. Patterson gasped and took a step backward when she noticed the alien woman. But Marcus was too focused on Whisker's rapidly declining vital signs to worry about his client's comfort. And he barely noticed when Zara moved closer to the examination table until her silver hands were hovering just inches above the cat's matted fur. The moment her palms made contact with Whisker's body, everything in the room seemed to stop. The cat's labored breathing steadied. Mrs. Patterson's anxious muttering fell silent, and even the street noise outside seemed to fade away as Zara's hair began to emit the faintest blue glow that gradually grew brighter and more intense until it looked like she had captured pieces of the ocean and woven them through her crystalline strands. Marcus watched in stunned amazement as the cat's eyes opened and focused, as its breathing became strong and regular, as years of age seemed to melt away from its tired body. But what shocked him even more was the sound of Zara's voice, soft and melodious, but carrying an accent he couldn't identify, speaking her first words since arriving on Earth. Pain, ... gone now. The blue light in her hair pulsed once more before fading back to its usual dull transparency. And Whiskers sat up on the examination table, meowed loudly, and began purring with more energy than Mrs. Patterson claimed he'd shown in months, while Zara swayed slightly on her feet, as if the healing had cost her something significant. Marcus reached out instinctively to steady her, and the moment his hand touched her shoulder, he felt a strange tingling sensation, followed by an overwhelming wave of emotion that wasn't his own. Centuries of accumulated sadness. The weight of watching entire worlds die. The desperate hunger to take away suffering even at the cost of her own well-being. And he understood in that instant that Zara wasn't just empathic, but was some kind of natural healer whose very existence was tied to absorbing and neutralizing pain. Mrs. Patterson left 20 minutes later with a completely transformed cat, and a story that she would tell to anyone who would listen. And by the time Marcus closed the clinic that evening, 3 more people had called, asking about the miracle alien who could heal animals with just a touch. While Zara sat quietly in the corner chair, her hair occasionally flickering with tiny sparks of blue light whenever she looked at him directly. That night, as Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling and listening to the soft sounds of Zara moving around the apartment, he realized that he'd stumbled into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple adoption he'd brought home. Someone whose abilities could change everything. And judging by the increasing number of phone calls and the strange vehicles he'd noticed parked across the street all day, he wasn't the only one who was beginning to understand just how valuable Zara really was within 3 days of Whisker's miraculous recovery. Marcus's veterinary clinic transformed from a quiet neighborhood practice into something resembling a refugee camp. With desperate families camping outside his doors at all hours, some driving hundreds of miles with dying pets cradled in their arms. Others flying in from different continents after hearing whispered stories on social media about the silver-skinned alien, who could bring animals back from the edge of death with nothing but her touch. Zara worked tirelessly from dawn until midnight, her crystalline hair blazing with increasingly brilliant blue light as she moved from case to case, healing everything from terminal cancers to genetic disorders that veterinary science had declared hopeless. And with each successful treatment, Marcus noticed she seemed to come alive in ways he'd never seen before, smiling at grateful owners, speaking more frequently, even laughing softly when a healed puppy licked her face with enthusiastic gratitude. But as the weeks passed and the miraculous healings continued, Marcus began to observe troubling changes that made his stomach twist with growing worry. Zara was losing weight despite eating more than ever before. Her silver skin had developed a translucent quality that made her veins visible like delicate purple rivers beneath the surface. And most disturbing of all, she had begun to tremble uncontrollably whenever she thought no one was watching, as if some invisible force was slowly draining the life from her body, one healing at a time. The morning everything changed started like any other, with a line of hopeful pet owners stretching around the block. But it ended with the arrival of 3 black vehicles that pulled up simultaneously outside the clinic with the precision of a military operation, disgorging a group of officials in expensive suits, who carried themselves with the unmistakable authority of people accustomed to getting whatever they wanted without question. The leader introduced himself as Ambassador Korvac, a tall reptilian being with scales that shifted from green to gold depending on the light, and eyes that reminded Marcus uncomfortably of a predator evaluating prey, and he wasted no time in explaining that the Galactic Federation had been monitoring Zara's activities with great interest and had decided that her unique abilities were far too valuable to be wasted on household pets when there were entire colony worlds suffering from plagues and diseases that killed thousands daily. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as Korvac outlined the Federation's plans to relocate Zara to a specialized facility where her healing capabilities could be optimized for maximum galactic benefit, using language that made it sound like they were discussing a piece of medical equipment, rather than a living being who had already endured more trauma than anyone should have to bear. The argument that followed grew increasingly heated as Marcus refused to hand over Zara, pointing out that she was legally his responsibility and had the right to choose her own fate, while Korvac's patience wore thin and his scaled features hardened into something genuinely threatening as he made it clear that the Federation's request was really more of a politely worded demand that could, as Lee, become considerably less polite if Marcus continued to be unreasonable. During the peak of their confrontation, as voices raised and accusations flew back and forth across the crowded waiting room filled with terrified pet owners and their animals, Zara suddenly swayed on her feet and collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud that silenced everyone present, her crystalline hair flickering erratically between blue and complete darkness as if some internal power source was failing. Marcus dropped to his knees beside her unconscious form and pressed his fingers to her neck, feeling her pulse racing irregularly while her skin burned with fever. And in that moment of crisis, everything became terrifyingly clear. Zara wasn't just healing animals, she was absorbing their pain, their diseases, their suffering into her own body, and after months of taking on case after case without any way to release that accumulated agony, she was literally dying from an overdose of other beings' trauma. As he cradled her fevering body and felt the weight of all those grateful families watching from the doorway, Marcus realized with growing horror that the mysterious plague that had wiped out her entire homeworld might not have been a disease at all, but rather the inevitable result of a species so naturally compassionate that they absorbed suffering until it killed them. And now the Federation officials were circling like vultures, ready to repeat that same tragedy on a galactic scale by using Zara's deadly gift until there was nothing left of her but another empty bed in another empty clinic in another dead world. The moment Ambassador Korvac and his officials left the clinic with barely concealed threats about returning with proper authorization, Marcus knew they had perhaps hours before Federation security forces would storm through his doors and drag Zara away to some sterile facility where she would heal strangers until her body finally gave out completely. So he made the desperate decision to call Elena Rodriguez, a former military pilot whose name had been whispered in underground circles as someone who helped special aliens disappear when the Federation's interest became too dangerous for their survival. Elena arrived within 30 minutes, driving a modified medical transport that looked ordinary from the outside, but hummed with the kind of advanced shielding technology that could fool most scanning equipment. And as they carefully loaded the still unconscious Zara into the vehicle's hidden compartment, Marcus caught sight of black vehicles beginning to circle the neighborhood like sharks sensing blood in the water. The journey into the mountains took 3 hours of winding roads and several stops to switch vehicles, during which Zara drifted in and out of consciousness, her crystalline hair flickering weakly while she mumbled words in her native language that sounded like prayers or perhaps farewells. And Marcus held her hand throughout the entire trip, feeling her fever spike and drop unpredictably while Elena navigated through checkpoints with forged documents and a confidence that came from years of outwitting Federation authorities. The sanctuary hidden deep in the Colorado Rockies looked like nothing more than an abandoned mining facility from the outside. But as they descended through hidden elevators and reinforced corridors, Marcus discovered an entire underground city, populated by dozens of alien refugees whose abilities had made them too valuable or too dangerous for the Federation to ignore. A telepath whose mind contained the location of lost colony ships. A being who could manipulate gravity with his emotions. A creature whose tears could dissolve any known material. All living and hiding because their gifts had made them targets rather than treasures. Dr. Sarah Kim, Korean-American xenobiologist, who had fled the Federation's research division after discovering their true intentions, examined Zara in a medical bay that rivaled anything Marcus had seen in major hospitals. And what she revealed made his worst fears seem like optimistic fantasies. Zara's people, the Netherians, had never been meant to heal alone, but rather worked in bonded pairs where one partner absorbed suffering while the other provided a psychic release valve, creating a perfect balance that allowed them to help others without destroying themselves in the process. The devastating truth was that the Federation had known this critical detail when they first encountered Netherian healers centuries ago, but had deliberately separated bonded pairs to maximize their individual output, effectively turning the galaxy's most compassionate species into living medical tools that burned out and died within months of being isolated from their partners. Which explained why Zara's homeworld had been wiped out not by a plague, but by the accumulated grief and pain of an entire species trying to heal a galaxy while slowly killing themselves through their own limitless empathy. Sarah explained that creating a new psychic bond was theoretically possible, but extraordinarily dangerous, requiring a human partner to open their mind completely to share not just Zara's current suffering, but every moment of pain she had absorbed since her arrival on Earth, including the traumatic memories of healing hundreds of animals. while her own body slowly poisoned itself with their redirected agony. Despite Sarah's warnings about potential permanent psychological damage or even death, Marcus volunteered immediately, knowing that Zara would die within days if something didn't change. And as the medical equipment hummed around them and Elena stood guard at the entrance, listening for Federation search teams, he lay down on the bed beside Zara and allowed Sarah to activate the neural interface that would either save them both or destroy his mind in the attempt. The moment the connection established, Marcus screamed as every healing Zara had performed crashed into his consciousness like a tsunami of accumulated trauma. The terror of dying animals, the desperation of their owners, the weight of absorbing suffering without release. All of it flooding through his human brain, which had never been designed to process such overwhelming emotional input. But somehow, impossibly, instead of breaking under the assault, his mind began to sort through the chaos, creating channels and pathways that allowed the pain to flow through him and dissipate rather than accumulate. And as Zara's crystalline hair blazed with golden light for the first time since her rescue, Marcus realized that humans possessed something unique in the galaxy: the ability to absorb and process emotional trauma without being consumed by it, making them perfect partners for empathic species who had been dying alone for centuries, while the Federation harvested their gifts without understanding the cost. The psychic connection between Marcus and Zara had done more than save her life. It had unlocked memories buried deep within her consciousness. Memories that the Federation had hoped would die with her species. And as her strength returned over the following days, she made the decision that would either bring justice to the galaxy or get them all killed. She would broadcast the truth about what really happened to her people, using their newly formed empathic bond to share not just words, but actual experiences that no court or council could dismiss as fabricated evidence. Elena's underground network had access to communication systems that could reach every major world in the Federation simultaneously, but the moment they activated such a broadcast, their location would be exposed to every security force in the galaxy, giving them perhaps minutes before orbital bombardments reduced the mountain sanctuary to radioactive dust, which meant they had one chance to tell Zara's story before the Federation silenced them forever. As Marcus held Zara's hand and opened his mind to serve as her anchor, she began to transmit not just the facts of her people's destruction, but the actual memories, the sensation of absorbing pain without release. The gradual realization that Matsalad Bazaso, the gradual realization that their Federation handlers were deliberately keeping them separated from their bonding partners. The horror of watching friends and family members die from empathic overload, while being told their sacrifice was necessary for the greater good of galactic peace. The broadcast reached billions of beings across hundreds of worlds simultaneously, carrying with it the undeniable emotional truth of genocide disguised as medical research. And within hours, the response was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Entire Federation member species began demanding answers. Colony worlds that had benefited from Zephyrian healing centuries ago rose up in outrage. And even Federation officials who had been unaware of the conspiracy found themselves facing populations ready to tear apart the very government they had trusted to protect them. Ambassador Korvac and his conspirators were arrested within days as evidence poured in from a dozen different worlds, revealing a centuries-long pattern of exploiting empathic species, separating bonded pairs, and allowing healers to die rather than admitting that the Federation's medical miracles came at the cost of systematic murder. But the real revolution began when Zara and Marcus demonstrated something that changed everything. Humans could form stable empathic bonds with virtually any species, creating healing partnerships that were stronger and more sustainable than anything the galaxy had seen before. The first Zephyrian Healing Institute opened 6 months later in downtown Denver. housed in a gleaming tower that had been donated by a grateful tech billionaire whose daughter Zara had saved from terminal leukemia. And within its walls, Marcus and Zara began training the first generation of human-alien healing teams, teaching them the delicate art of sharing pain without being consumed by it, while former Federation research facilities across the galaxy were converted into proper healing centers where empathic beings could work safely with human partners. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Timid aliens who had spent years in hiding found new purpose as healers, while humans discovered they possessed an unexpected gift for emotional resilience that made them ideal partners for species. The Federation had nearly driven to extinction, creating bonds that transcended language, culture, and biology to forge connections based purely on the desire to ease suffering wherever it was found. Marcus often stood at the Institute's observation deck in the evenings, watching the city lights twinkle below while Zara worked with new students in the training rooms, her crystalline hair now permanently radiant with golden light that reflected her restored health and purpose. And he marveled at how a single act of compassion, adopting the saddest alien at a refugee shelter, had somehow grown into a galactic movement that was redefining what it meant to heal, to help, and to hope. The irony wasn't lost on him that humanity, once considered the most aggressive and unpredictable species in the Federation, had become the galaxy's greatest healers, simply because they possess the psychological flexibility to absorb trauma without being destroyed by it, proving that sometimes the greatest strengths emerge from the very qualities that others might consider weaknesses. And as he watched a young human mimetic successfully bond with a frightened alien refugee in the training room below, Marcus realized that what had started as two broken souls trying to heal each other had become something infinitely larger, a revolution of empathy that would echo across the stars for generations to come, ensuring that no being would ever again have to face their pain alone,